The carriage rocked violently along the stone paths that wound through the woods of the Duchy of Ravenshollow, and Amelia Pemberton felt every jolt like a hammer striking against her chest. Her gloved hands trembled as she clutched the last letter she had received from her future husband. The elegantly penned words in blue ink already memorized after countless readings. "My dearest Miss Pemberton, I eagerly await our meeting at the altar of St. Bartholomew's Chapel. May our union be blessed by the heavens and bring prosperity to our families." The signature at the end remained a mystery she had tried to decipher for months. With devotion, R. Ashworth, only R. Ashworth. Not even his full name had been revealed during the long months of correspondence that preceded this fateful day. "We have arrived?" "My lady," the coachman announced, his voice muffled by the wind blowing through the ancient trees. Ravenshollow Castle loomed before her like a fortress of grey stone, its Gothic spires piercing the cloudy October sky. The arched windows reflected the pale afternoon light, creating a solemn aspect that made Amelia's stomach churn with nervousness. She alighted from the carriage with the help of a footman, her satin shoes touching the cobblestone ground delicately. Her wedding gown, fashioned in London by the finest tailors, weighed on her shoulders like a burden. The white silk fabric embroidered with silver threads had cost a fortune her family did not possess. Yet another debt, this. Arranged marriage was meant to settle. "Miss Pemberton," a feminine voice called to her. A middle-aged woman, clad in an elegant purple velvet gown, approached with measured steps. "I am Lady Margaret Ashworth, your betrothed's aunt." "Welcome to our family," Amelia curtsied respectfully, keeping her eyes cast down as etiquette dictated. "Lady Ashworth, it is an honor to meet you." "Nervousness is natural, my dear." "We all go through it," Lady Margaret smiled, though her eyes remained cold as marble. "Come, we must prepare you. The ceremony will begin in an hour." Following through the main entrance of the castle, Amelia was led through corridors adorned with ancient tapestries and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the stone walls, mingling with the distant murmur of guests already gathering in the chapel. During the final preparations in her temporary chambers, Amelia allowed her mind to wander to happier times. She remembered Lucas Whitmore, her dear childhood friend, who had departed from her life so abruptly 8 years ago. They would play in the gardens of her father's country estate, build sandcastles on the beaches of Dover, and dream of adventures in distant lands. Lucas had always promised they would marry when they grew up. His words whispered beneath the shadow of the ancient oak that grew in the gardens of Pemberton Manor. He had been her first love, her confidant, her anchor in a world that often proved cruel and unpredictable. Then came that terrible winter morning, when the news arrived like a dagger to the heart. Lucas had died in a carriage accident in the Swiss Alps, where he was studying with a private tutor. His body was never found, lost forever in the icy waters of a mountain river. "It is time." "My lady," Lady Margaret interrupted her melancholic reverie. The lace veil was carefully positioned over her head, obscuring her view of the outside world like an ethereal mist. Through the delicate fabric, everything seemed distant and imprecise, as if she were observing life through a dream. St. Bartholomew's Chapel was filled with guests, their voices forming a low murmur that ceased immediately when the doors swung open. The organ began to play the wedding march, its solemn notes reverberating through the stone vaults, decorated with colorful stained glass windows that cast rainbows upon the polished oak pews. Amelia walked alone down the central aisle, her steps measured and calculated as she had practiced countless times. Her father had passed away 2 years prior, a victim of a sudden fever, leaving her an orphan and dependent on the generosity of distant relatives who had quickly arranged this marriage to rid themselves of the financial burden she represented. Through the veil, she could discern the tall silhouette of a man waiting by the altar. His shoulders were broad, his erect posture conveyed confidence, but the details of his face remained obscured by the distance and the fabric covering her eyes. Reverend Blackthorne awaited with his Bible open, his clerical attire impeccably arranged. Several members of the local gentry occupied the front pews, their jewels sparkling in the candlelight that illuminated the sacred space. When she finally reached the altar, Amelia stopped beside the man who would become her husband in a matter of minutes. Her breath was uneven. Her heart pounded so violently that she feared everyone could hear it. "Beloved brethren," Reverend Blackthorne began with a solemn voice, "we gather today before God to witness the sacred union between these two hearts." The cleric's words seemed distant, as if reaching her through a long tunnel. Amelia felt disconnected from reality, as if she were a spectator watching someone else's life unfold before her eyes. "If anyone knows of any impediment why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let him speak now or forever hold his peace," the Reverend continued. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wind sighing through the window gaps dared to break the solemnity of the moment. "Very well. Mr. Ashworth, do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? To love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," replied a voice that made Amelia's blood run cold in her veins. That voice. She knew that deep, melodious timbre, etched into her memory like a song from childhood. But it was impossible. Utterly impossible. "Miss Pemberton," the Reverend turned to her. "Do you take this man to be your lawful wedded husband, to love, honor, and obey, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, until death do you part?" Amelia opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her throat was dry as parchment. Her thoughts spun in desperate circles, trying to process what she had just heard. "Miss Pemberton?" the Reverend prompted gently. I do," she finally managed to murmur. "Then, by the power vested in me by the Holy Church, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The moment had come. With visibly trembling hands, the man beside her delicately lifted the veil covering Amelia's face, raising it over her head as if revealing a long-lost treasure. And there, with his familiar green eyes shining with unshed tears and a sad smile curving his lips, stood Lucas Whitmore, alive, breathing, real. The world around Amelia completely vanished. The guests, the Reverend, the candles, the colorful stained glass, all dissolved into an indistinct blur as she stared at the face of the man she had mourned as dead, who she had grieved in silence for 8 interminable years. Lucas? His name escaped her lips like a whispered prayer. "Hello." "Amelia," he replied with the same sweetness as always, as if 8 years hadn't passed since they last spoke, beneath the ancient oak of their childhood. The world seemed to halt for an eternal instant. The guests' murmurs transformed into a distant hum as Amelia tried to process the impossibility unfolding before her eyes. Lucas, her Lucas, stood there, alive, breathing, with the same freckles scattered across his nose that she used to count on summer afternoons in her childhood. How is this possible?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising buzz of the congregation, who were beginning to realize that something extraordinary was happening. Lucas stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her face. The same intensity she remembered, the same way he used to look at her when he promised to protect her from the village bullies, or when they swore eternal friendship beneath the stars. "We need to talk," he murmured, extending his gloved hand towards her, "but not here. Trust me, Amelia, as you always have." Reverend Blackthorne cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly disconcerted by the palpable tension between the newlyweds. Lady Margaret approached with quick steps, her face reflecting a mixture of irritation and concern. "Is there a problem?" she asked in a low but firm voice. "The guests are awaiting their felicitations." Lucas straightened his shoulders, assuming a posture Amelia did not recognize, authoritative, almost noble. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight it hadn't possessed at 16. "My wife is a little indisposed by the emotion of the moment," he replied with disconcerting naturalness. "Lady Margaret, please escort our guests to the main hall. We shall serve the banquet within the hour." The older woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she studied Lucas with renewed attention. For a moment, Amelia feared Lady Margaret might perceive something amiss, but finally she nodded. "Very well, Roberto. But do not delay too long. The Duke of Wessex came specifically to meet your new wife, Roberto." The name echoed in Amelia's mind like a death knell. Roberto Ashworth, the man with whom she had corresponded for months, whose elegant letters had been her only window into her future husband's personality. But it was impossible for Lucas to be Roberto. Simply impossible. As the guests were led out of the chapel amidst curious murmurs, Lucas, or whoever he was now, offered Amelia his arm. "Come," he said softly. "I know a place where we can talk without interruption." She accepted his arm more by instinct than conscious choice, allowing him to lead her through a side door that opened into a less ornate corridor. Their footsteps echoed in the silence as they walked, and Amelia felt as if she were floating outside her own body, watching this impossible version of her life unfold. Lucas led her to a small but cozy library, with oak bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling and a fireplace where flames danced merrily. The aroma of aged leather and parchment filled the air, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that contrasted dramatically with the grandeur of the chapel. He closed the door behind them, and, for a moment, they simply stood in silence, studying each other as if trying to decipher a complex enigma. "You died," Amelia finally managed to articulate, her voice heavy with 8 years of unresolved grief. "I wept for you. I visited your empty grave. How dare you appear now on my wedding day pretending to be someone else?" Lucas ran his hands through his brown hair, a familiar gesture that made Amelia's heart ache. When he raised his eyes again, she saw there a depth of suffering that had not existed in his youth. "I did not die, Amelia. But Roberto Ashworth died. My cousin." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "The man you were corresponding with, my cousin Roberto, passed away 3 months ago from typhoid fever at his estate in Scotland." The world swayed slightly around Amelia, and she had to brace herself against the arm of a leather armchair to maintain her balance. "Your cousin? But that means that I assumed his identity." "Yes." Lucas approached cautiously, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. "Roberto had no close family beyond Lady Margaret, and when I learned through her about the arranged marriage with you, I could not allow it to happen." "Why?" The word came out as a strangled cry. "Why didn't you just come back to me? Why did you pretend to be dead all these years?" "Because I was dead, Amelia. At least the man you knew was." He drew closer, and she could see the small scars that marked his hands, the lines of worry around his eyes. "On that trip to Switzerland, there was an accident, yes, but I did not die. I was captured by smugglers working on the trade routes of the Alps. I spent 4 years as a prisoner, working in their illegal operations. When I finally managed to escape, I was no longer the naive young man you knew." His voice grew softer, laden with painful memories. "I returned to England, but found you were betrothed to my cousin. I couldn't simply appear and destroy your wedding plans." Amelia felt tears burn her eyes, a mixture of anger and relief and confusion that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "So you decided to assume his identity? Marry me under false pretenses?" "I decided to protect you," he corrected firmly. "Roberto was not a kind man, Amelia. Through Lady Margaret, I learned he had accumulated enormous gambling debts and saw this marriage merely as a way to access the inheritance you would receive when you turned 25. He also had violent tendencies." The revelation hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. During all those months of correspondence, she had built an image of Roberto Ashworth based on his elegant letters and respectful words. To learn that those letters had been written by Lucas, and that the true Roberto was a dangerous man, made her head spin. "The letters," she murmured. "You wrote them? All of them?" He nodded. "Roberto had shown me some of his previous letters before he died, boasting of how he had found a wealthy wife. When I assumed his identity, I had to continue the correspondence. But every word I wrote came from my heart, Amelia. Every sentiment was real." She stepped away from him, needing space to process it all. The library seemed smaller now, the walls closing in around her as she tried to grasp the ramifications of what Lucas had done. "You lied to me," she finally said. "For months, you lied about who you were." "To protect you," he repeated, taking a step towards her. "Amelia, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day during all these years. When I learned you were in danger, that you would be forced to marry a man who could harm you, I could not stand by. And what if I didn't want your protection?" she retorted, her voice gaining strength. What if I had chosen to go through with this marriage of my own free will? Then I would have respected your choice, he replied without hesitation. But knowing you as I do, I know this marriage was arranged by your guardians to clear their debts. You had no real choice, Amelia. At least now, married to me, you will have the freedom you always desired. She wanted to argue, to shout at him for presuming to know her desires after so many years apart. But a treacherous part of her heart whispered that he was right. She had felt trapped, forced to accept a future she hadn't chosen. The guests, she said abruptly, recalling the reality that awaited them beyond that cozy library. Lady Margaret, if she discovers who you really are— She won't discover, Lucas said with confidence. Roberto and I were distant cousins and saw each other rarely. Lady Margaret only met me a few times when we were children. The physical resemblance between us was always remarkable. We were often mistaken for each other when young. But what about the others? Roberto's friends, his associates? Roberto had spent the last 5 years in Scotland, managing remote estates. He corresponded mainly through letters and rarely received visitors. Lucas drew closer again, and this time she did not step away. I have carefully planned every detail, Amelia. You are safe now. She gazed into the green eyes she knew so well, searching for signs of the boy she had loved. He was still there, buried beneath layers of experience and suffering, but still recognizable. The same fierce determination that had led him to confront the bullies of his childhood, now merely directed towards protecting her from dangers far more real and adult. What happens now? She asked softly. Lucas held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she intertwined her fingers with his. The familiar touch made her heart quicken, awakening memories of promises whispered beneath the moonlight. Now, we will face our guests as husband and wife, he said. And then, when we are alone, we will have all the time in the world to get to know each other again. The main hall of Ravenshollow Castle gleamed under the light of dozens of crystal chandeliers, their reflections dancing upon the gold silk-lined walls. Tables draped with immaculate linen displayed polished silver platters and fine china, while arrangements of white roses and ivy perfumed the air with their delicate fragrance. Amelia entered the hall beside Lucas, her arm intertwined with his with a familiarity that years of separation could not erase. Still, every fiber of her being vibrated with a nervous tension that threatened to betray the whirlwind of emotions churning beneath her exterior composure. Smile, Lucas murmured discreetly as they greeted approaching guests. We are newlyweds in love, remember? The irony of his words did not go unnoticed. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, walking beside Lucas as his wife. But she never imagined it would happen under such circumstances, surrounded by lies and false identities. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, a grave voice interrupted them. A corpulent man, with elaborately waxed grey whiskers, approached with a golden-haired young woman at his side. Allow me to introduce my daughter, Lady Beatrice Thornfield. Beatrice, my dear, these are our hosts. Lady Beatrice curtsied gracefully, her blue eyes studying Amelia with ill-disguised curiosity. Mrs. Ashworth, what a magnificent gown. It must have cost a fortune. Lady Beatrice is known for her frankness. The older man coughed awkwardly. I am Lord Thornfield of Yorkshire County. I knew your late father years ago, Roberto. Amelia felt Lucas stiffen beside her, though his smile remained impassive. Lord Thornfield, of course. My father often mentioned your dealings in Yorkshire. Prosperous dealings, I trust. Lord Thornfield inquired with a shrewd glint in his eyes. I have heard troubling rumors about some financial difficulties within the Ashworth family. Unfounded rumors, I assure you. Lady Margaret appeared like a guardian angel, deftly inserting herself into the conversation. Roberto's Scottish estate has been exceedingly profitable. Has it not, my nephew? Exceedingly, Lucas agreed without hesitation. In fact, we are considering expanding our operations further into northern Scotland. While the men engaged in a discussion about trade routes and wool prices, Amelia found herself being led by Lady Beatrice to a more secluded corner of the hall. You simply must tell me everything about your romance, Beatrice whispered conspiratorially, her eyes gleaming with anticipated gossip. I heard you corresponded for months without ever meeting. How dramatic. What was it like when you finally saw him without the veil? Amelia's heart quickened dangerously. It was surprising, I dare say. He's far more handsome than I expected. The Ashworths were always known for their looks. But Roberto... Beatrice paused, frowning slightly. I must confess he looks different from how I remembered him. Taller, perhaps? And his eyes. I don't recall them being quite so green. A chill ran down Amelia's spine. You knew each other? Oh, only briefly, some years ago. My father conducted business with the Ashworth family when I was younger. Roberto must have been 15, perhaps 16 at the time. Beatrice tilted her head, studying Lucas from a distance. But people change, don't they? Especially after so many years in Scotland. Yes, Amelia replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. The Scottish climate must have been transformative. Before Beatrice could ask any more compromising questions, the sound of crystal being gently tapped echoed through the hall. Lady Margaret positioned herself near the head table, drawing the guests' attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if you please, I would like to propose a toast to the newlyweds. Her voice carried clearly through the silent hall. May Roberto and Amelia find in their union the happiness their hearts yearn for. Champagne flutes were raised, and Amelia forced herself to smile as the guests toasted their new life. Lucas remained by her side, his firm hand at her back, offering a silent comfort she wasn't sure whether to accept or reject. Now, Lady Margaret continued, I believe everyone would like to hear a few words from the groom himself. The hall fell silent in anticipation, and Amelia felt Lucas stiffen beside her. Speaking publicly meant more opportunities for someone to notice discrepancies, more chances for their charade to be uncovered. Lucas stepped forward, his confident posture masking any nervousness he might feel. My dear friends and family, I thank you for sharing this most special day with us. His voice carried easily across the hall, and Amelia noticed how he had modulated his tone to sound subtly different, deeper, with a slight inflection that hadn't existed in his youth. Amelia and I came to know each other through letters, but we have discovered that some connections transcend written words. They exist in the very soul. His eyes met hers for a moment, heavy with meaning. I promise to honor and protect my wife, and to build with her a life founded on truth and mutual devotion. The guests applauded warmly, but Amelia barely heard them. Lucas's words had been carefully chosen, a veiled promise directed specifically at her. Truth and mutual devotion, concepts that had been shattered by the circumstances of their reunion. When dinner was served, Amelia found herself seated at the head of the table beside Lucas, playing the role of the happy wife while navigating conversations about politics, agriculture, and the latest scandals of London society. Mrs. Ashworth, a feminine voice called to her. Lady Cordelia Blackheart, an elegant middle-aged woman with elaborately coiffed silver hair, leaned towards her. From which region does your family originate? Pemberton is not a name I immediately recognize. We are from Kent, Amelia replied carefully. A modest family with small but productive country estates. Kent, how charming. I know several Pembertons from Surrey. Perhaps you are related? Lady Cordelia smiled, but there was something sharp in her eyes. It would be interesting to trace the family lines. Perhaps, Amelia agreed vaguely, feeling like prey being studied by a skilled predator. Lady Cordelia has a particular interest in genealogy, Lucas interjected smoothly. She can trace her own lineage back to Norman times. A passion some consider excessive, Lady Cordelia chuckled, but her attention remained fixed on Amelia. But families are important, don't you think? They define so much of who we are, our connections, our obligations. There was something menacing in the way she emphasized the word obligations, and Amelia felt as if she were walking on thin ice. Each question, each curious glance from the guests represented a potential danger to the charade she and Lucas were playing. For the remainder of the dinner, she observed Lucas interact with the guests with an ease that was simultaneously admirable and unsettling. He had become a consummate actor, capable of completely assuming another man's identity. How many other facets of his personality had changed during his years of absence? When the guests finally began to depart, offering final felicitations and promises of future visits, Amelia felt exhausted by the constant tension of maintaining her facade. Every smile had required a tremendous effort. Every word of thanks had been carefully calculated. "You were perfect," Lady Margaret murmured as the last guests departed. No one suspected anything amiss, but Amelia was not so sure. She had noticed curious glances, probing questions, moments of hesitation that suggested at least some guests had noticed something strange. The charade might have worked for one night, but how long could they maintain it? When they were finally alone in the silent hall, surrounded only by the low-burning candles and the remnants of the wedding feast, the reality of her situation descended upon Amelia like an overwhelming weight. She was married, legally married, to a man who had assumed another's identity. A man she had loved deeply, but who was now a stranger whose motives and intentions she could not fully decipher. Lucas approached her, extending his hand in a silent offer of support. "You were magnificent tonight." "I was a liar," she corrected bitterly. "Just like you. We were survivors," he replied softly. "And now we have a chance to build something real from this complicated foundation." Amelia gazed into the green eyes that had haunted her dreams for 8 years, searching for signs of the boy she had known. He was still there, but obscured by layers of experience and suffering she could only imagine. The question that tormented her was whether they could find their way back to each other, or if the lies necessary to protect her would ultimately destroy any chance of genuine happiness they might have. The bridal chambers of Ravenshollow Castle were a sanctuary of refined elegance, with walls clad in French wallpaper in shades of ivory and gold. A white marble fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows upon the polished mahogany furniture. The four-poster bed, adorned with crimson velvet drapes and covered with the finest Irish linen, seemed intimidating in the dim light cast by the perfumed candles. Amelia stood by the window overlooking the gardens, still clad in her wedding attire, watching the castle's distant towers silhouetted against the night sky. Her hands trembled imperceptibly as she tried to process the extraordinary events of the day. She had married a ghost, a man who should have been dead for 8 years, yet had reappeared to save her from a fate she hadn't even known she should fear. The door opened softly behind her, and she did not need to turn to know it was Lucas. His footsteps were familiar, even after so many years, cautious yet determined, like when he approached an injured animal in the fields of their childhood. "The servants have been dismissed for the night," he said softly, maintaining a respectful distance. "I thought we could talk with more privacy." "Talk," she repeated, finally turning to face him. "Which of your lies would you like to begin with, my lord husband?" Lucas had removed his formal coat and cravat, leaving only his white shirt open at the collar. The sight stirred inconvenient memories of summer mornings when they would run through the meadows, their clothes disheveled from carefree play. But the man before her now was no longer that boy. There was a hardness to his shoulders, a constant watchfulness in his eyes that spoke of experiences she could not comprehend. "About all of them," he replied honestly. "You deserve to know the full truth, Amelia. Everything I went through, everything that transformed me into the man I am now." She moved to one of the armchairs near the fireplace, her movements deliberately graceful, despite the emotional turbulence that consumed her. "Then tell me, starting with the accident that supposedly took your life." Lucas approached, but remained standing, as if formality could somehow lessen the forced intimacy of their situation. "The carriage truly overturned in the Swiss Alps. My tutor, Professor Hartwell, died on impact. I survived but was injured and unconscious when I was found by smugglers operating on the mountain routes. Why didn't they take you to a hospital?" "To the authorities? Because they recognized an opportunity when they saw one." His voice carried in bitterness she had never heard before. "A well-dressed young Englishman, obviously from a wealthy family, could be valuable. Initially they planned to demand a ransom, but when I regained consciousness and tried to resist..." He paused, unconsciously touching an almost invisible scar on his forehead. "They decided it would be more profitable to use me for forced labor." Amelia felt her heart clench with involuntary compassion. As angry as she was at his lies, she couldn't ignore the real pain in his voice. 4 years, you said?" 4 years carrying contraband through treacherous passes, sleeping in icy caves, surviving on scraps they deemed fit for a prisoner. He moved to the fireplace, resting a hand on the marble mantel. I learned to speak Italian and German out of necessity, developed muscles I never knew I possessed, and discovered I could endure far more suffering than I ever thought possible. How did you manage to escape? An avalanche blocked the main pass they used during the winter of the 4th year. In the confusion and desperation of finding alternative routes, vigilance lessened. I managed to steal enough provisions for a week and disappeared into a snowstorm. His eyes met hers across the dancing flames. It took me 3 months to reach civilization, living as a beggar, working on remote farms for food. The picture he painted was so different from the privileged young man she had known that Amelia found it difficult to reconcile them. The Lucas of her youth had been sheltered, educated, gentled to the point of naivety. This man had been forged by adversities she could barely imagine. When I finally returned to England, he continued, I discovered I had been officially declared dead. My family estate had been sold to pay debts my tutor had accumulated in my name during our travels. I no longer had a home, a family, or a legal identity. But you could have proven who you were. Surely there were people who would recognize you. Some, perhaps. But I had changed a great deal, Amelia. Not just physically, but in every way. And when I discreetly investigated your situation, he hesitated, clearly struggling with his next words. I discovered you were engaged, that your guardians had arranged an advantageous marriage that would resolve the financial problems left by your father's death. The nature of her emotions became more complex. So you simply decided I needed saving? Without consulting me, without giving me the opportunity to choose. Would you have chosen poverty over security? He challenged softly. Would you have rejected a marriage that would protect you and honor your father's debts? The question struck at the heart of her internal conflicts because she knew the answer. Even knowing now about Roberto Ashworth's true nature, she likely would have proceeded with the marriage out of a sense of duty and practical necessity. The realization bothered her more than she cared to admit. That didn't give you the right to decide for me, she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its former strength. You're right, he admitted, surprising her. I didn't have that right. But when I learned through Lady Margaret about Roberto's true character, he turned to face her directly. He had beaten a maid nearly to death the previous year. He kept mistresses in brothels known for brutal treatment of women. His gambling debts were to dangerous men who wouldn't hesitate to use his wife as collateral if he failed to pay. Each revelation fell upon Amelia like physical blows. For months, she had corresponded with a man she believed to be honorable, respectful, worthy of her trust. Knowing that his letters had been written by Lucas offered some comfort, but the reality of the true Roberto Ashworth made her feel nauseous. How did you manage to assume his identity so completely? She asked, needing practical details to maintain her sanity. Roberto and I had always resembled each other remarkably, second cousins, but with very similar family features. When he died of typhoid fever on his isolated Scottish estate, only a few servants were present. Lucas moved to the chair opposite hers, finally sitting down. I arrived 2 days after his funeral, introducing myself as a distant relative come to pay my respects. The servants mistook me for Roberto. Apparently he had changed a great deal during his illness, lost weight, appeared older. And you didn't correct them. Not immediately. By the time they realized the mistake, I had already learned enough details about Roberto's life to sustain the charade. And when Lady Margaret arrived a week later, informing me of the imminent marriage to you, he sighed deeply. The decision made itself. Amelia studied the face she knew so well, searching for signs of dishonesty or manipulation. But all she could see was the same Lucas who had promised to protect her from school bullies, who had sworn he would always look after her, who had whispered promises of eternal love beneath the ancient oak of their childhood. You said you never stopped loving me, she said softly. How can you be sure after so many years? I've changed too, Lucas. The girl you knew might no longer exist. He leaned forward, his green eyes intense in the firelight. Because during the darkest moments of the past 8 years, the memory of your smile was what kept me alive. When I was cold, hungry, when I didn't know if I would see another dawn, I thought of you. Of your laughter when we managed to escape our etiquette lessons. Of the way your eyes sparkled when we discovered a hidden bird's nest in the gardens. His words stirred an avalanche of memories she had tried to suppress for years. Tears stung her eyes, and she blinked rapidly to hold them back. "And what if they discover who you really are?" she asked. "Lady Beatrice has already noticed differences. Others might start asking questions. Then we will face it together," he replied without hesitation. "But I have properties in remote places, places where we can live in peace away from prying eyes. You will have the freedom you always desired, Amelia. We can travel, see the world, build a life based on our own choices." The offer was tempting, more tempting than she cared to admit. But a fundamental question remained between them, unspoken yet hovering in the tension-filled air. "And tonight?" she finally asked, her cheeks flushing. "We are legally married, but under false pretenses. What do we expect from each other?" Lucas remained silent for a long moment, studying the flames dancing in the fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I only expect what you are willing to offer, Amelia. Nothing more, nothing less. We can be strangers learning to know each other again, or we can try to rebuild what we once had. The choice is yours." The silence that followed was charged with unexplored possibilities and unanswered questions. Amelia knew that her answer in this moment would shape the rest of their lives together, for better or worse. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Amelia contemplated the question she had asked. The soft crackle of the flames in the fireplace seemed amplified in the silence that followed, each second stretching like an eternity as she and Lucas studied each other across the golden gloom that bathed the bridal chambers. Finally, she rose from the armchair, moving to the window again, her hands pressed against the cold pane as she watched the shadows of the gardens beneath the silvery light of the full moon. "I need to know one thing," she said, without turning around. "During all these years you spent away, were there other women?" The question came out more vulnerable than she intended, revealing fears she had tried to bury. Lucas remained silent for so long that she began to dread the answer. "There were occasions," he finally admitted, his honesty brutal but necessary. "During my years as a prisoner, no. But after I escaped, when I was trying to rebuild some semblance of a life, yes, there were some women." Amelia closed her eyes, feeling a pang of jealousy she had no right to feel. They had been separated by circumstances beyond their control, and she herself had prepared to marry another man. "But they never meant anything beyond temporary companionship," Lucas continued, his voice closer now. She realized he had stood up and moved closer. "I could never stop comparing them to you, to the memory of what we had. None of them managed to touch my heart the way you did. And I," she whispered, "spent all these years mourning a ghost, refusing to consider other suitors until my guardians forced this arrangement. I don't know if that makes me faithful or foolish. It makes you human," he replied softly. She felt the warmth of his presence behind her, but he didn't dare touch her. "And it gives me hope that perhaps there is still something between us that can be nurtured again." Amelia turned to face him, finding herself only inches away. In the soft moonlight streaming through the window, he seemed almost ethereal, as if he truly were the ghost she had mourned for so many years. "You've changed so much," she murmured, raising a hesitant hand to touch his face. His scars were almost invisible in the gloom, but she could feel them beneath her fingertips. "These marks, what else did they do to you?" Lucas captured her hand, pressing it against his face. "Nothing that cannot be healed with time and care. The physical scars are the least important, Amelia. It's the invisible marks that worry me more." "What kind of invisible marks?" He stepped back slightly, moving to the mahogany armoire in the corner of the room. From within, he withdrew a small, dark blue velvet box, his hands trembling imperceptibly as he held it. "During all these years, I carried this with me," he said, moving back to her. "In the darkest moments when I thought I might not survive, looking at this gave me the strength to go on." Amelia watched with growing fascination as he opened the box, revealing a delicate white gold ring with a small sapphire surrounded by diamonds. Her heart stopped as she recognized it. "Your grandmother's ring," she whispered. You said it would be mine when we married. I managed to save it from my family's financial ruin because I always carried it with me as a talisman. His green eyes shone with undisguised emotion. Even when all seemed lost, even when I thought I would never see you again, I couldn't part with it. Tears stung Amelia's eyes as childhood memories flooded her mind. Lucas had shown her the ring when they were 15, solemnly promising that one day it would be hers. They had planned an entire life together beneath that ancient oak, dreaming of a house full of children and decades of shared happiness. Lucas, she began, but he knelt before her, holding the ring with reverence. I know our marriage today wasn't as we planned in our youth, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was built on necessary lies and impossible circumstances. But Amelia, my love for you was never a lie. Every letter I wrote using Roberto's name contained my true heart. He held up the ring, his hands steady, despite the intensity of the moment. So I ask you now, not as Roberto Ashworth, but as Lucas Whitmore, the man who has loved you since childhood, do you accept me as your true husband? Not out of obligation or circumstance, but by your own choice? The world seemed to stop around Amelia. This was the proposal she had dreamed of receiving 8 years ago. The words she had longed to hear during all those lonely nights when she mourned his death. But now, faced with the complex reality of who they had become, the decision carried a weight her youth could not have comprehended. You're asking me to trust you again, she said slowly. After all the lies, all the false identities, you want me to accept that this time you are being completely honest. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that the man you loved still exists in here, he replied, touching his chest over his heart. Changed, marked by experiences, but fundamentally the same in my love for you. Amelia studied his face in the silvery light, searching for signs of the boy she had known. He was there, in the small wrinkles around his eyes when he smiled, in the way his brow furrowed when he was nervous, in the curve of his lips when he spoke her name. If I accept this ring, she finally said, if I choose to try again, will you promise me something? Anything. Promise me there will be no more lies between us. No matter how difficult the truth, no matter how it might hurt me, you will be completely honest with me from now on. I promise, he replied without hesitation. By the memory of our childhood love, by the extraordinary woman you have become, and by the life we can still build together. I promise I will never lie to you again. Amelia extended her left hand, watching as Lucas carefully slipped his grandmother's ring onto her ring finger. The metal was surprisingly warm, as if it had absorbed the heat of his eager hands, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her. Then yes, she whispered. I accept you, Lucas Whitmore, as my true husband. Not because circumstances forced us, but because I choose to believe that true love can survive even the most impossible trials. He rose slowly, his hands finding her face with almost religious reverence. Amelia, my dearest Amelia, you have no idea how much hope you have just returned to my heart. When he leaned in to kiss her, she did not pull away. The kiss was tentative at first, as if both were testing the waters of an intimacy that had been severed by years of forced separation. But it gradually deepened, carrying the weight of 8 years of longing, of unwritten letters, of promises broken by circumstance and finally renewed by choice. When they parted, both were breathing unevenly, their foreheads touching as they processed the magnitude of what they had just promised each other. We have a lot of time to make up for, Lucas murmured against her lips. So much to relearn about who we've become. Then let's start slowly, Amelia replied, her hands resting on his chest. We have the rest of our lives to rediscover each other. He smiled, and for the first time since she had lifted her veil in the chapel, she fully recognized the boy she had loved. Slowly sounds perfect. I've waited 8 years for you. I can wait however long it takes for you to feel comfortable with me again. Thank you, she whispered, touching the ring that now adorned her finger. For saving me from Roberto, for keeping your childhood promises, for finding your way back to me against all odds. Thank you for giving me a second chance, he replied, for choosing to trust me despite everything. They spent the rest of the night talking by the fireplace, sharing stories of the lost years, laughing at childhood memories, and slowly beginning to weave the threads of a new life together. When they finally fell asleep, it was on opposite sides of the grand bed, respectful of the emotional journey they still had to traverse. But their hands remained intertwined across the space between them, the sapphire ring glinting in the soft light of the dying embers, a symbol of promises kept and of a love that had survived the impossible. Dawn arrived gently in the chambers of Raven's Hollow Castle, its first golden lights filtering through the velvet curtains and awakening Amelia from a slumber more peaceful than she had experienced in years. The sapphire ring on her finger caught the morning rays, sending small, dancing rainbows across the walls as she stirred beneath the Irish linen sheets. Lucas was no longer in bed, but she could hear the soft sound of water being poured into the porcelain basin from behind the hand-painted silk screen. The domestic intimacy of the moment, sharing a room, hearing his morning rituals, awoke a mix of familiarity and nervousness that made her blush. "Good morning." His voice emerged from behind the screen, carrying an audible smile. "I hope I haven't woken you." "I was already awake," she lied softly, pulling her ivory silk dressing gown over her nightdress. The truth was, she had woken several times during the night, watching his sleeping silhouette and still struggling to fully accept the reality of his presence. When he emerged from behind the screen, already dressed in dark riding breeches and a white shirt, Amelia felt her heart quicken involuntarily. The morning light revealed details that the night's gloom had concealed. The way his shoulders had broadened during the years of forced labor, how his hands had grown more calloused, how a small scar near his temple spoke of violences she preferred not to imagine. "Lady Margaret sent word that breakfast will be served in half an hour," he said, approaching cautiously, "and that we have unexpected visitors." "Visitors?" Amelia frowned, immediately alert. "Who?" "Apparently some business associates of Roberto's arrived during the night, coming from London. They claim to have urgent business that cannot wait." The concern in his voice was unmistakable. Lady Margaret seemed uneasy with their arrival. Amelia's stomach clenched with apprehension. Each new contact with people who had known the true Roberto represented a potential danger to their carefully constructed charade. "Do you know them?" "Not by the names Lady Margaret mentioned. But during my investigation into Roberto's life, I heard rumors about his gambling creditors. Men who don't take no for an answer and have persuasive methods of collecting debts." Amelia sank heavily into the chair near the dressing table, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process the implications. "So they've come after the money Roberto owed them?" "Probably. And now, as Roberto's widow, you have theoretically inherited his debts as well." Lucas moved to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders through the silk robe. "But don't worry. I have enough resources to deal with whatever amount they might be claiming." "Resources obtained how?" she asked, turning to face him through the mirror. "You said you lost everything when you were declared dead." An enigmatic smile curved his lips, and for the first time she glimpsed the seasoned and potentially dangerous man he had become. "During my years as a prisoner of the smugglers, I learned a great deal about secret trade routes and valuable commodities. When I escaped, I used that knowledge in a creative way." "Lucas," she turned fully to face him, "please tell me you haven't become a criminal." "Nothing quite so dramatic," he chuckled, but there was a hardness in his eyes that had not been there in his youth. "Let's just say I identified certain opportunities in international trade that less informed men missed. Strategic investments in commodities I knew would become valuable. Trade routes I was aware of before official competitors." The answer was vague enough to be unsettling, but before Amelia could press for more details, a firm knock at the door interrupted their conversation. "Madam Ashworth?" Lady Margaret's voice called from the corridor. "The gentlemen from London insist on speaking with you and your husband immediately. They say it's a matter of extreme urgency." Lucas and Amelia exchanged tense glances. This was the test they both feared, facing people who could expose their charade before hostile strangers with questionable motives. We will be there in a few minutes. Lady Margaret, Lucas replied in a firm voice. Please offer our visitors tea and explain that we need to prepare ourselves properly to receive them. As Lady Margaret's footsteps receded down the corridor, Lucas turned to Amelia with a serious expression. We need to coordinate. If these men are truly Roberto's creditors, they will know details of his life that I may not have uncovered. What do you suggest? She asked, rising to begin dressing in a navy blue wool morning gown. Let me lead the conversation as much as possible. If they ask something I can't answer, feign indisposition. Your illness yesterday will be a perfect excuse. And, Amelia, he hesitated, if something goes wrong, if we realize our charade has been discovered, I need you to trust me completely. Do exactly as I say. When I say it, without question. The seriousness in his voice sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. Do you think we'll be in physical danger? I hope not. But men who lend money to desperate gamblers are rarely known for their patience or gentle methods. He moved to the armoire, retrieving a small but obviously functional pistol from a hidden compartment. I prefer to be prepared for any eventuality. The sight of the weapon made the reality of their situation fall upon Amelia like an overwhelming weight. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from reluctant bride to the wife of a supposedly dead man who apparently had dangerous enemies and secrets she was only just beginning to uncover. 15 minutes later, they descended the castle's main staircase toward the morning room. Amelia had chosen her jewelry carefully, discreet but obviously expensive pieces that suggested wealth without ostentation. Lucas walked beside her with the confident bearing of an aristocrat. But she noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, a vigilance that spoke of years living in constant alert. The morning room was bathed in golden morning light. Its French windows opened to the formal gardens where gardeners were already at work among the late rose beds. Lady Margaret awaited near the breakfast table, her hands clasped in a way that revealed ill-concealed nervousness. Two men occupied the armchairs near the unlit fireplace, and Amelia felt an immediate chill upon seeing them. The first was tall and thin, with dark hair slicked back with pomade, and small eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the room. The second was shorter, but substantially wider, with massive hands that rested on his knees like hammers waiting to be wielded. Ah, the newlyweds. The taller man rose with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, I presume. I am Cornelius Grimsby, and this is my associate, Mr. Bartholomew Pike. We represent certain commercial interests that had dealings with the late Roberto. Late? Lucas raised an eyebrow with convincing confusion. Gentlemen, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. As you can see, I am perfectly alive. The two men exchanged quick glances, and Grimsby chuckled dryly. Of course. I beg your pardon for the inappropriate expression. What I meant is that the Roberto with whom we conducted business, shall we say, no longer has the same financial obligations he previously had. I don't understand you, Amelia interjected, forcing confusion into her voice. My husband has honored all his business commitments. Surely there are no outstanding debts of significance. Pike spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble that made the windows subtly vibrate. Madame, your husband owes us £500 from a particularly optimistic wager on a cockfight last month. With accrued interest, the sum is now £600. Impossible, Lucas retorted immediately. I haven't gambled in months. There must be some mistake. Grimsby stepped closer, pulling a yellowed piece of paper from the inner pocket of his coat. We have here a promissory note signed in your own hand, dated 3 weeks ago. Do you recognize your signature, Mr. Ashworth? The moment of truth had arrived. Lucas examined the paper carefully, and Amelia saw his jaw clench almost imperceptibly. The signature was obviously authentic, belonging to the real Roberto, but admitting it would reveal his charade. This is not my signature, he finally said, his voice carrying exactly the right tone of offended indignation. Someone has clearly impersonated me to contract this debt. Interesting, Pike murmured, rising slowly. His considerable bulk made the floorboards creak under his feet. Because we have 3 witnesses who saw you sign this document personally at the Fleet Street Gambling Club. Then your witnesses are either lying or mistaken. Lucas held his ground. Lady Margaret, Please confirm to these gentlemen that I have been here at the castle for the entire past month, preparing for my wedding." Lady Margaret hesitated for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, her eyes darting between Lucas and the menacing visitors. "Naturally," she finally said. "Roberto has not left the estate for weeks." Grimsby smiled again, but this time there was something predatory in his expression. "How convenient. Unfortunately, our experience suggests that relatives often confuse dates when financial matters are involved." The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Amelia could feel the danger emanating from the two men like heat from a furnace, and she realized Lucas had subtly positioned himself between her and the visitors. "Gentlemen," Lucas said in a dangerously calm voice, "are you suggesting that my aunt would lie to protect me?" "We are suggesting," Pike replied, taking a threatening step towards them, "that £600 is too much money to simply disappear because someone claims convenient amnesia." It was then that Lucas smiled, and Amelia recognized something of the reckless boy she had known, only amplified by experience and tempered by a dangerous edge that made her blood run cold. "Then perhaps we should settle this matter once and for all." Lucas's declaration echoed through the morning room like a challenge thrown onto a dueling ground. Amelia felt the air thicken with tension as she watched the two men react to his words. Grimsby narrowed his eyes while Pike flexed the fingers of his massive hands in a threatening manner. "Settle it how, exactly?" Grimsby asked, his voice carrying ill-concealed dangerousness. Lucas moved fluidly to a mahogany desk near the window, retrieving a small key from his waistcoat pocket. He opened a secret drawer, and from it extracted a leather pouch that made a telltale metallic clink when he placed it on the polished surface. £600, he announced calmly, untying the pouch's drawstrings to reveal gold coins that glittered in the morning light. "The full amount you claim is owed to you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Lady Margaret seemed surprised by the sudden display of wealth. Amelia watched, fascinated, as Lucas methodically counted the coins, stacking them in organized groups with the precision of an experienced accountant. "However," he continued, raising his eyes to meet Grimsby's, "this generosity comes with a condition. You will provide a full receipt declaring that all of Roberto Ashworth's debts have been settled in full, and you will promise never again to bother my family with claims related to gambling or any other business matters." Pike took a step forward, his true intentions clearly visible on his brutally honest face. "And what if we refuse your terms?" "Then," Lucas replied with a smile that contained not a drop of warmth, "you will leave my property immediately and without a penny. And if you return, you will discover that I have connections far more dangerous than you can imagine." The veiled threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Amelia saw something flicker across Grimsby's face, a quick, almost predatory assessment of Lucas that suggested recognition of someone who had survived far worse situations than intimidating creditors. "You are not the same Roberto from 3 weeks ago," Grimsby observed slowly. "Something has changed." "Marriage has that effect on some men," Lucas replied without blinking. "Responsibility, maturity, the need to protect those we love, all of it can completely transform a man's perspective on risk and consequences." It was a brilliant answer, using the very charade as an explanation for any perceptible change in behavior. Amelia felt a reluctant admiration for the way Lucas navigated the dangerous conversation, turning each potentially compromising question into a confirmation of his fabricated story. Grimsby studied the gold coins for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded to Pike. "Prepare the receipt." "It seems Mr. Ashworth has found his conscience along with his wife." As Pike laboriously drafted a document declaring all debts settled, Amelia took the opportunity to observe Lucas more carefully. The ease with which he had produced such a substantial sum of money, his confidence in dealing with obviously dangerous men, the way his hands remained firmly steady despite the tension. All of it spoke of experiences that went far beyond what he had told her the previous night. "Done," Pike announced, handing the paper to Grimsby for review. Grimsby carefully read each line before signing with elaborate flourishes. "Very well, Mr. Ashworth. Our business is concluded." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Though I must mention that Roberto was always recognizable by a particular scar on his right hand. A hot iron mark from a youthful incident with horses. Amelia's heart stopped. This was precisely the kind of specific detail that could completely destroy their charade. She watched with growing horror as all eyes turned to Lucas's hands. But Lucas simply smiled, removing the leather gloves he had worn all morning. He extended his right hand, revealing an irregular scar near his thumb. Not from a hot iron, Amelia realized, but likely from one of the many violences he had endured during his years of captivity. This scar, he asked casually, a constant reminder of why I don't trust unfamiliar horses. Grimsby examined the mark, and Amelia saw frustration quickly cross his face. Clearly, he had expected to catch Lucas in a lie, but the scar, though of a different origin, was visually convincing enough to sustain the charade. Interesting how some marks stay with us, isn't it? Grimsby murmured, gathering the gold coins with efficient movements. Very well. Our transaction is complete. Mr. Pike and I will return to London this very morning. Excellent, Lady Margaret interjected quickly. I will have your carriages prepared immediately. After the two men departed, escorted by a visibly relieved footman, the silence in the morning room became oppressive. Lady Margaret was the first to speak, her voice laden with perplexity. Roberto, where did all that money come from? And how did you know about the scar Grimsby mentioned? Lucas carefully put his gloves back on, his face taking on a thoughtful expression. Aunt Margaret, during my years in Scotland, I made investments that proved extremely profitable. As for the scar, he hesitated convincingly. Frankly, I don't recall Grimsby mentioning it before. It was fortunate that this old mark from a riding accident served the purpose. It was another cleverly constructed lie. But Amelia was beginning to wonder how many layers of dishonesty surrounded the man she had married. Each explanation revealed new complexities, new mysteries she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. Well, Lady Margaret finally said, the important thing is that this unpleasant situation has been resolved. But Roberto, dear, in the future, please consult me before dealing with such questionable types. Naturally, Lucas agreed. And now, if you'll excuse me, I would like to show Amelia the gardens before the sun gets too hot. They exited into the formal gardens through the French doors, walking in silence along the gravel paths until they were far enough from the castle to speak freely. The morning air was cool and fragrant with the scent of the last autumn roses and the earthy smell of falling leaves. Do you want to explain what just happened? Amelia finally asked, stopping beside an ornamental fountain, where marble cherubs poured clear water into a circular basin. I saved our marriage, and possibly our lives, Lucas replied with disconcerting simplicity. With money you obtained through methods you haven't fully explained, demonstrating knowledge of dangerous situations that suggest experiences far beyond alpine smuggling, and using a scar that conveniently matched their expectations. She turned to face him directly. Lucas, who have you truly become during these 8 years? He remained silent for so long that she began to wonder if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of memories she could not fully comprehend. I became someone capable of protecting the people I love, no matter the personal cost. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Amelia, there are aspects of my life during these years that may always remain obscure to you. Not because I wish to lie, but because some experiences cannot be fully shared without causing unnecessary harm. Are you asking me to accept mysteries about the man I married? I am asking you to accept that the man who loves you beyond anything in this world will do anything necessary to ensure your safety and happiness. His green eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken, including bearing alone any dark burden that may exist in my past. It was an answer that simultaneously answered and didn't answer her question. But as she studied his face in the golden morning light, Amelia realized something fundamental. Regardless of what mysteries surrounded Lucas, regardless of how many layers of complexity he had developed, the love in his eyes was absolutely genuine and unchanged since their youth. So what do we do now? She asked softly. Now, he smiled, and this time it was the full, uncomplicated smile of the boy she had loved. We live. We build a life together, far from creditors and false identities and complicated pasts. We travel to places where no one knows Roberto Ashworth or cares about old debts. We rediscover each other and create memories that belong only to us. And Lady Margaret? Will she never suspect? Lady Margaret wants to believe that Roberto has finally matured and found happiness. As long as we maintain that illusion, she will not ask inconvenient questions. He intertwined his fingers with hers, the sapphire ring catching the light like a solidified promise. Amelia, I know I'm asking a great deal. I know our situation is impossible and complicated in ways no marriage should be. But you saved me, she interrupted him, surprising them both with the certainty in her voice. From Roberto, from dangerous creditors, from a life that would have slowly destroyed me. And despite all the lies and complexities, you kept the promises you made when we were children. They walked back towards the castle, their hands intertwined and their steps synchronized as they had been during the walks of their youth. The future remained uncertain, full of unanswered questions and mysteries that might never be completely resolved. But as they entered the castle where they would officially begin their lives as husband and wife, Amelia felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. Lucas had returned from the dead to save her, had assumed a false identity to protect her, and had risked everything to give her a chance at genuine happiness. Regardless of what secrets his past still held, one thing remained absolutely clear. The love they had shared under the ancient oak tree of their childhood had survived 8 years of separation, trauma, and impossible circumstances. And perhaps in the end, that was all that truly mattered.